And welcome back to our second episode of the Dusty Archives History Podcast, featuring myself, Ben Alcher, and our resident history expert, Katrina Bill. When we last left off, we were talking all things progressive era, starting with the most notable figure of the era, of course, Teddy Roosevelt, but you know all about him. And of course,
Oh
the
man.
goal of this podcast is to dive deep, deep, deep into the archives of history, talk about some things you may not remember, some things you forgot about, and maybe even some things you never even heard of in the first place. So, while Katrina's getting all settled in there, we will remind you once again we talked about Teddy Roosevelt, and really the big thing we talked about, Katrina, going back to our first episode, and something you certainly wanted to highlight from this era, the effects of yellow journalism and muckraking, and that's where we're going to pick things up today.
Yes, it's so many moving parts. Just so many. So it's best to just kind of break it down piece by piece and then just to see how everything just kind of ties in together. Makes a nice little lasagna.
There you go, and that's really how we left things again from episode one. And just a quick reminder, the overarching point of our episodic series here on the Dusty Archives is really about the effects that yellow journalism and muckraking had not only on policy as it related to Teddy Roosevelt and the government, but also the big immigrant population of the time as well, right?
Yes, yeah, the big immigration boom that happened. What did we say last time? There was like a million, on average, about a million per year coming in. That I'm pretty sure that was on both coasts, but the big one, Ellis Island, New York City, which is where all of this takes place.
Yeah,
At
just
least this story.
huge, huge time for population growth in America. This is really sort of one of the critical points where the American dream and the selling of the American dream has taken hold throughout the world. But again, our focus tonight really on the yellow journalism aspect to this era. It's a term that some people are probably very familiar with. We talked about it again in our previous episode, but just to remind folks, kind of a basic idea as to what yellow journalism consists of.
Basic's the word for it, sure. You got these big
So we'll
bold
start
headlines.
with the big picture, the Cliffs notes, and then
Yeah,
again,
literally
then
big
we get into
pictures.
specifics.
Literally big pictures. Let's see here. Big pictures.
There you go.
Literally, prime example. This is when it's said to have started, but it was really ramping up before then, and that's what I'd like to get into tonight is the background on Pulitzer and Hearst and how it all kind of came to a head, really. Because that what I just showed was Pulitzer's newspaper, the New York World, when the USS Maine exploded, and then this was Hearst's, and he did offer a $50,000 reward for the perpetrator
So we're
of
talking
it.
big pictures, big
Literally,
headlines,
yes.
whole lot of sensationalism going on,
Oh yeah.
and of course, the two key figures at the center of it all, Joseph Pulitzer and William Randolph Hearst. Mentioned them, of course, in our opening episode, but certainly when we talk about the rise of yellow journalism, it is worth taking a deeper look at these two individuals and just how they came to be so influential on this era.
Definitely worth a deep dive. And I mean, even still, the names are mentioned in everyday conversations. Because Patty Hearst, I think, was his granddaughter or daughter. And that whole big case with Stockholm syndrome and all that fun stuff that happened.
And the
It's,
Hearst name is still involved in media to this
I
day.
mean, doesn't the Hearst Corporation still own WMUR?
Yep, Channel 9
Yep.
in New Hampshire. Yep.
And then, Pulitzer, obviously the Pulitzer Prize. Working at a bookstore for so many years, I've saw, oh, the Pulitzer Prize winner of this year, and I'm like, wow, that's cool. Don't even know what that is, honestly. And I know it's a big literature prize, but why is it a big literary prize? Why is it this big name? Like, then learning about him, I was like, this is all right. Here it is. There's the click. Excuse me. So to me, it makes sense to do things chronologically. So we're gonna start with the older of the two, Joey Pulitzer. He was born
Joey to
April.
his friends.
Huh?
Joey to his friends.
Joe. Well, he would sign. We can get into this later. He would sign his telegrams as JP if he was in a good mood. But then if you really got on his bad side, he would sign it with his full name of Joseph Pulitzer.
There you go.
And that's how people, that's according to Don Seitz, Seitz. I don't know how to pronounce the name, forgive me. He worked very closely with Pulitzer on the New York World, and he wrote a biography on Pulitzer called Joseph Pulitzer, His Life and Letters, published in 1924. Although the main biography that I used was, oh my gosh, where'd it go? Joseph Pulitzer and His World, which is published in 1941. Most of what we know about Joey is from secondary sources, census records, a lot of Don Seitz, a lot of what we know about him, we had to kind of get through conjecture
So no
because
autobiography.
as close of an autobiography as I got was his Life and Letters by Don Seitz.
Okay.
We don't have much primary sources other than the letters that he would send and the letters that Seitz would send. He was very, I don't want to say closed off, but if you asked him about his growing up, he would kind of joke around and then dismiss it immediately. So it's not really, we didn't know much about him until he got to New York and signed up for the Lincoln Cavalry. But he was born, what we do know is he was born April 10th, 1847 in Mako, Hungary. Papa was Philip Pulitzer, Politzer. And Mama was Louise Berger. Papa was, quote, part Magyar? I'm not sure how to
Magyar.
pronounce. I've heard it
Yep, it's
pronounced.
a common ethnicity in Hungary, I believe.
Didn't know that, but I saw it in the book and I was like, that's worth noting down. Let's see, part Magyar or Hungarian, that makes sense. Part Jewish, the exact ratio is uncertain for Papa. Mama was born Louise Berger and was German and Catholic. Joey was one of four, even though he and younger brother Albert were the only two that survived childhood. Mama wanted Albert to be this priest and have all these great expectations for him, but then something, again, we're not talking about Albert, but he does come up later, I promise. Some reason that didn't work out, and he still ended up moving to New York City to be with Joey anyway. 1853, the Pulitzers moved 135 miles northeast to Budapest.
Either, both.
The capital of
The
Hungary.
capital. Yep.
And Mama, Papa passed away of heart disease, we believe. There was no year in the books, but I'm assuming it was 1853, but it doesn't make sense that he would die like just after they moved. I mean, he could have, I don't know. Mama Louise eventually remarried to Max Blau. Quote, JP's attachment apparently was not to the ghost of his father, but to his mother. Described as a remarkably beautiful and intelligent woman. In later life, he always kept his mother's picture near him. So to me, I was like, Mama's boy. I'm sure Albert was too, because what little boys don't love their mamas?
Mm-hmm.
So Joey and Max didn't get along that well, apparently. Again, nobody really knows. So in the summer of 1864, Joey just said, we'll just see what else is out there.
Right.
He didn't have any special training or education specific to anything. Bit my tongue. It's gonna slow down. That's what. Sorry, I'm like racing through all this. According to James Wyman Barrett, who wrote Pulitzer and His World, it appears that his only talent was to ask questions and to drag information out of reluctant or poorly informed sources.
Well,
My
sounds like the
favorite,
making of a newsman.
My favorite phrase that kept popping up in this book was he was exasperatingly inquisitive. And that's a direct quote several times in the book. And I was like, same. Me too. So Joey was off, fighting spirit, ready to go. He wanted to serve in the army because he had uncles on Louis' mama's side that, fought with Austria and Hungary before they separated.
Mhm.
But he got denied because he had weak eyes and an unpromising physique. And as I mentioned before, near the end of his life, he was pretty much blind. He had a detached retina. His eyesight was already going even at 17.
Wow.
Yeah, it was pretty bad. So he then changed course and said, "You know what? We're gonna go to Paris and fight for Napoleon." Sounds cool. Napoleon's a short dude. Actually, that's a myth. Um, he's average height for today's standard.
There you go.
He was 5'6". Just throwing that out there. And he got the same response to Paris. Weak eyes, unpromising physique. See you later, bye. So he later dazed out of Paris and he went to London. And he got the same result. So he was no doubt feeling bummed out and probably embarrassed. He heads home to Mama and Max, but then he stopped in Hamburg anyway, Hamburg, Germany. He, quote, tried to get work as a seaman, but was laughed out of the hiring hall.
Probably the
Probably
same issues.
because, probably, more than likely. But then somehow divine intervention occurred. Joey found somebody that was recruiting people to go over to America to fight for the Civil War. Excuse me. So he's still wanting to fight. He's like, you know what? American dream. Let's go, baby. Let's get it. He got in somehow. I don't know. Because if Napoleon didn't want, I mean, it makes sense that Napoleon wouldn't want somebody with weak eyes and unpromising physique. But then if you're getting denied by England, you'd imagine that America would just be like, maybe not.
I mean, it's hard to see where it's a civil war ongoing. I mean, presuming he decided to fight with the Union, it might have just been sort of all hands on deck, because
Yeah,
of how bloody that war was. And
that
I'm
makes
sure that's,
sense.
another topic for another time, obviously, but
Yeah,
um,
I'm military
this
history,
is
not my thing.
but this is obviously, uh 1850s, 1860s, so this is early, much earlier than most of the other Eastern European immigrants would start
Hmm.
to make their way for America. So this is really,
This is
very,
1864. Yep.
yeah. So this is way before the sort of advent of Eastern European immigrants coming over, which again, this is really the time period, progressive era, late 1800s, early 1900s, when that boom happens.
Right. So he was booked as an immigrant, quote, actually as a recruit. Then he landed in America. I think it was Boston on September 30th in September of 1864. Our favorite word, Ben, allegedly,
Allegedly.
collected his own bounty. Uh, and Joey migrated from the docking station it was Boston to New York City. Then in New York City, he enlisted in the Lincoln Cavalry because he said this is the reasoning that Barrett gave in um, Pulitzer in his world. I've heard of Lincoln. That guy's pretty cool. I swear that was like the exact reasoning. So he, Company L, Lincoln Cavalry, September 30th, 1864, signed up for a year's enlistment. Didn't need to go that long, but still. Um, let's see. Quote, Lincoln Cavalry was largely German, having been organized by Carl Schurz, the German-American soldier, editor, statesman, with whom J.P. was much more closely associated later in St. Louis. J.P. could speak little English, but was fluent in German and French. So he came over here, no clue how to speak English. He could, but not great. So when he listed an assumed typo, put him down as Joseph Puletz's, I think. Again, not Hungarian, not German, don't know the languages. It's for people that can correct me in my pronunciation. I don't know why I said protect.
But certainly not uncommon that, an immigrant, especially one who wasn't able to speak English, would come over and have their name warped in some fashion or form.
I just don't understand how Pulitzer
Well, that sort
was
of all depends
difficult.
on your agent that you talk to and how well they're able to interpret what you're
Fair.
telling them.
Um, but it's Pouletzes. So I'm assuming Puletzes?
Probably something in that vein.
Pulitz. But after the Civil War, he rose up out of the ashes as Joseph Pulitzer. Don't know why it ended up being from Pulitzer to Pulitz to Pulitzer, but here we are. Um, he did also lie on the enlistment form, saying that he was 18 when he was actually 17.
Certainly not uncommon.
Oh, yeah, it still is common. uh, he wouldn't turn 18 until April 10th, 1865. Joey was constantly picked on while in the Lincoln Cavalry. So, like, it was just constant, like, hazing. I'm assuming it's because of small stature. He did have a fairly large nose. His chin was very receded compared to his nose. Like, his, let me see if I can find a photograph of him. Um,
Bit of a
but
caricature type face.
yeah, that's a good way to describe it. Uh, so when the war was over, which probably again, military history not my thing. If you know more about if viewers, listeners know more about the Civil War, let me know.
1865 is when it wraps
1865,
up.
yeah, after he was 18. Um,
So he
he's
serves, but he doesn't serve very long.
no, no, he does like I'd say, well, Lincoln was assassinated April of 1865.
I believe that's correct.
Let's see what Professor Google has to say. April 15th, 1865. Look
There
at
you
me
go, right on
go.
the money.
Uh, so if you no, anyway, war's over. He's now Joey's now only living with $13 in his pocket in 1865 money. That's his monthly stipend. Where did my inflation calculator go? Because I did do the math at one point, and
Well,
then
either way, he's out of the military now, so he's got to find something else to do, right?
yeah, so he's at there it is, $244.87 in 2023 money. That's per month, so it's like nothing to
Peanuts.
live on. Peanuts, yeah. He only had his overcoat from the army, uniform, and just a few trinkets, accessories. He asked where he could go, and again with the hazing, he was told St. Louis as a joke. So, St. Louis was having its own immigration boom during this time. And he managed to luck out because it was German speaking individuals. St. Louis
Well,
was a huge, like, um,
it was really the last big major city before you got in towards westward expansion.
what's the word that I'm,
Because,
what's the
well,
word that I'm thinking of? Not
post
Mecca.
Metropolis, is that the one?
No, like this, like,
Well, so in context,
beacon.
post Civil War, right? I mean, then we start to get into some more westward expansion because basically from St. Louis to California is just
Nothing.
wilderness at this point. There's been, no sort of foundation or anything like that. But post Civil War is when you start to get a lot of these early immigrants start to, follow that American dream. This is the era of the Oregon Trail, but Pulitzer decides to stick in St. Louis. Doesn't really fancy himself much of an adventure, I imagine.
No, no, he thought he wanted adventure, but but his time in Lincoln Cavalry was just like, we're good. We're all set. Um, I'm still not thinking of the right word. I was thinking Mecca,
Mecca works. He
like
found what he needed in St. Louis, though.
this spot that's just like attracting, like moths to a lamp. That kind of
Mm-hmm.
attraction was, Germans were going to St. Louis.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so Joey arrives in, I think it's 1868. Again, we don't really know. It's all mostly conjecture. The earliest known record of him being in St. Louis is 1868. Put it that way. Um, so Joey's there. He gets a job as a report. Again, I'm sorry, my German is not great. Westliche Post. Westliche is how it's spelled. I say it how it's spelled, so I'm gonna go with. I know Germans pronounce W's as V's, so that's all you're getting from me.
Close enough.
Westliche Post.
So is this a German language newspaper based in
Yes,
St.
it was
Louis?
the leading German daily at the time.
Okay.
He got a job as a reporter, and what better job for a German-speaking person who's trying to learn English?
Especially one who's constantly inquisitive.
Exasperatingly inquisitive.
There you go.
He during his time here, he was in St. Louis. He was constantly hazed here as well. Don't know why. I really don't know. Um, but he kept his nose to the grindstone, eventually working a plethora of other jobs, such as he worked as a ferryman. He would put, he was the person that would put the coal into the steam engines.
Hmm.
Um, he would he worked as a mule handler for 2 days, but then he quit because he didn't like the food.
There you go.
That was one of the few things that he did actually very openly discuss. I don't know why. He was a very odd man, at least odd for us. Um, but then he found himself being self-taught at the Mercantile Library by a man named Udo Brockvogel.
Sure.
We're
So he
gonna
finds a mentor in St. Louis.
Yeah, go work at the library. I think he was an assistant librarian or just regular librarian. We had this natural knack for learning. Like, how you see a kid just poring over a book and you just go, oh, that's so cute.
Well, as you said, to this point, he'd never really had any sort of formal education, other than sort of maybe whatever basic military training he would have had, which would have been on the fly anyway, coming over to America in the middle of a war. So
Right.
he's worked some odd jobs. He's maybe started to learn a few things here and there just about life. And now, you get that opportunity to get the education bug, and I guess he seized upon it.
Yeah, and he was always asking questions, always going like, what's this? What's that? How does this work? He always had a knack for like history and politics and like legal and law studies. Those were what drew him. Um, he would stay from as soon as Udo opened those doors until Udo had to literally kick him out. He was every ounce of free time that Joey had, was at the Mercantile Library. Um, so while here, eventually after meeting Udo, Joey became a naturalized citizen. So finally, oh, here's a picture without the beard. But this was Joey,
Yeah,
large
you can
nose.
definitely see that caricature of a face.
Yes. One of his friends that worked for a German magazine called Puck would joke about, Joey, I'm gonna go draw your nose. Here's Joseph Kepler. Oh, this is a cartoon from Puck.
There you go.
So he had, very prominent nose, always wearing glasses because again, we guys. Um, yeah. So in St. Louis, he's talking with Udo. He's becoming friends with Udo. He eventually became a naturalized citizen and shortly became acquainted with a group of lawyers at a building called the Jones Assembly Building. Another odd job that Joey would run was running errands for these lawyers and serving papers. So, he would learn more about the legal proceedings at the same time as she was doing this job. A little while later, Joey meets Thomas Davidson, quote, a notable though eccentric scholar, then teaching Greek and Latin at the St. Louis High School. That's how Barrett described him. So I was like, all right, so maybe this is where Joey's getting the eccentricities from. I mean,
Right.
he's always kind of struck me as the eccentric person anyway. But he loved this Davidson, loved him, revered him. This further um, words work.
So at this point, he's learned a lot. Obviously, he's at the library constantly.
Still
He's
learning.
working in the lawyer's office. Now he's diving into, some more ancient studies with Greek and Latin. It seems like he's still continually searching for what will eventually become his passion and his pursuit in life.
Yes. So he's still working for the Vest League. Like he's working for, he's meeting up with the lawyers and he's meeting up with Davidson and he's still working for Vest League Post. Quote from the beginning, he had an eccentric conception of a reporter's duty. He liked to work and work he did, often from 10 in the morning until 2 the next morning, running down hot tips and writing fresh, clean copy. He responded to news flashes like a fireman to alarm. On the faintest scent of a story, he dashed madly about the streets of St. Louis, a pad of paper under his arm and his long linen duster flying in the wind. I'm the reporter from the Westleak Post. Give me the facts, was his breathless demand. So,
So interesting approach there. I mean, again, newspapers back in the time were not even necessarily dailies at this point. So you're
but the
sort of just
Westleak
getting,
was.
yeah. So you're getting, a little bit more general news, not necessarily always the news of the day. Sometimes it's just for, agricultural purposes, perhaps
Right.
at this time. Um, but certainly not what we would see it become later on.
Yeah, and he's still getting hazed. Like, let's just be real. He's still getting pranked. He's still getting hazed. Still a target. And a lot of the other reporters would go like, "Oh, hey Joey, I heard there's a great story in, this city that's 20 miles away."
Hmm.
So he'd go. But then because he was exasperatingly inquisitive, he would still ask questions and sure enough, he'd still have a story even though there was none. There was no actual story, but then he
He
would
would
find
figure
one.
one out.
He would find one and he would write one and then the Westleak Post had a story that no other St. Louis paper did.
There you go.
So it still worked out. And then about a year later in 1869, vacancy in the Missouri House of Representatives. Now, again, as a joke, reporters nominate him.
Hmm.
And he just ran with it, man. He was giving campaign speeches in German, he was giving them in English, and he was automatically like people's choice. So Princess Diana, who Joey's a people's prince. Uh so during this time, uh as a representative and for the rest of his life, he was fully he fully believed in transparency between politicians and the media and then the people. So he believed in full transparency, clear across the board,
Right.
which not bad. I'm down.
Yeah.
I'm fine with that.
Certainly an ideal way to approach life.
Yeah, and he wanted transparency, but like I said, between the politicians and the papers, constituents.
So does he end up winning the election?
Yes, he, like I said, he was just a shoo in. As soon as he started delivering those speeches in German, they were like the immigration population was just like, this guy's actually on our side. What? Like,
There you go.
I think that's kind of what resonated with them. Um, so the transparency between the politicians and the constituents was also evident through the newspapers he owned, starting with, you know, I'm just going to keep things clear. I'm going to gloss over all of the political backings that he did with his newspapers that he owned because I was highlighting stuff and I'm like, what does this have to do with the price of eggs in China? Like, what?
Well, let me back up then. How does he get from lowly reporter to newspaper owner? I mean, do
I
you
really
stumble
don't
into $1
know.
million? Wow. So
I
it's there's a
maybe.
quick rise
Oh, wait,
eventually there at some
here it
point.
is. All right, I did write it down. I'm sorry. I was like, I didn't think I wrote that down. I did. So, um, we're just gonna gloss over the political backings up until 1898, just to keep things clear, because we don't need to know about Samuel Tilden and William Bryan's Jennings Bryan, however you pronounce his name. Um, so the owners of the Westleek Post offered him a share of the ownership, and he accepted. And then he later purchased the Staatszeitung for a cheap price. We don't know how much, because again, he wasn't very
Right.
open about, especially with business deals. There was no clear year given when he was offered ownership of Westleek. There's no clear time when he was purchased a Staatszeitung, but we can assume it's before 1890s. Quote, the next day he sold the Staatszeitung for $20,000 to the St. Louis Globe, which badly needed the Associated Press franchise. That's also from Barrett. Finally, Joey could say he pulled himself up by the bootstraps and was a success, but he did not want to stop there. He was full steam ahead. But then he did get kind of distracted because he fell in love with Kate Davis. It's cute. Kate Davis was a distant cousin of Jefferson Davis, who was president of the Confederacy. So I found that kind of interesting,
Yeah, a little bit ironic.
a little bit. They got married June 18th, 1878. I know it kind of detracts from the main story a little bit, but it detracted from his career for a little bit as well.
So maybe where he starts out, churning these smaller papers and eventually getting involved with a bigger paper in the Globe, you
Yes,
know,
he did
at some point
purchase.
things slow down a little bit before he goes into full-fledged media acquisition mode.
Yeah, it kind of like he was ramping up a little bit and then stopped, smelled the roses of Kate Davis. That came out not how I wanted it to. Good thing we're all adults here. But the timeline does get muddy here anyway, too, because he did end up purchase the St. Louis Post. He went to John Dillon and said, who's owner of the St. Louis Dispatch, and said, I have an AP franchise. You need an AP, Associated Press
Yep.
franchise. Let's do it. So a couple days went by. Dillon finally says, yeah, all right. We'll do a merger. So that's how Joey went on to own the St. Louis Post-Dispatch.
Which would be
Um,
the biggest paper in the city at the time.
oh, I'm sorry. John Dillon owned the Post. Joey purchased the Dispatch for $2,500. Then he reached out to Dillon, who was the owner of the Post, to propose the merger because the Post didn't have the AP franchise, but Joey's Dispatch did, and
There
then
you go.
that's how Post Dispatch came to be. Again, just laying out that transparency thing. One of the first editorials that Joey wrote for the Post Dispatch. I'm sorry, this is taking a while. Hearst is going to take a little bit longer, unfortunately, because there's so much more primary sources with Hearst than there are
Sure.
with Joey. Um, let's see. Then 3 columns. Oh wait, where goggles? Help! It was with the Post Dispatch that Joey started to change how newspapers were laid out, like just as a whole.
Mm-hmm.
They went from the multiple
Columns. Yep.
columns with like the little tiny blurbs that are very difficult to read to like what we know now.
Yeah. A little more
Uh,
user friendly.
Easier to follow along,
Yep.
all that fun stuff.
Started to be able to include photographs, I'm sure, as well, because this is when photography started
Eventually,
to become a little bit more easier to work with.
eventually, I don't know if it was at this specific time, but it was definitely getting there.
Well, there's definitely, I mean,
There are
there's
political cartoons, absolutely.
right. I mean, artwork, sure, but records of photographs as early as into the 1840s,
Yep.
1850s, and This is technology that's developing through the time as we're starting to get into the Industrial Revolution era. And as you said, St. Louis is obviously one of those massive cities in terms of being sort of one of the last bastions in America before you get into westward expansion.
Bastion. I think that was the word I was looking for, actually. Thank
Well, there you go.
you.
Finally found it.
Tip of my tongue. But then 3 columns reserved for first page news were divided almost equally between local and telegraph items. None of them could be classified as hot items. That's what
Mhm.
Barrett says. That was a direct quote. I don't know what he means by it could be classified as hot. Like hot
Probably
off the
most
press,
notable at
maybe.
the time, yeah. Most
That's what
most
I'm.
urgent news.
That was the kind of like context that I was getting from it. Later on in the editorial page, Joey encapsulated what he believed journalism should be with the new policies of the Post-Dispatch. They were to serve no party but the people. There will be no organ of republicanism but the organ of truth. It will follow no caucuses but its own convictions. Will not support the administration but will criticize it. Will oppose all frauds and shams wherever and whatever they are. Will advocate principles and ideas rather than prejudices and partisanship. So again, he just wanted to get the objective facts out there. He wanted the politicians to be transparent with their constituents. He wanted just honesty across the board.
Now,
And
now we're
these,
in
sorry.
full-fledged media mogul mode.
Oh, yes. Yes. He does not stop from here. These were convictions that he held on to dearly, like until the end of his life in 1911. This was Joey Pulitzer to a T. I don't know what exactly happened in 1898 with the whole yellow journalism rivalry thing. Like, I do, but like, I still am, like, I know the facts, but I'm still trying to figure out how. You know what I mean? Um, but while at the helm of the Post-Dispatch, Joey would constantly expose to wealthy tax dodgers. He would boldly print their names and how much they owed in taxes.
There you go.
He contrasted these payments with those of the poor citizens. He offended the rich tax dodgers, but the poor flocked to his side, and the common people heard him gladly. He was like a social Robin Hood,
Yep.
right? He's like,
Definitely man of the people.
exactly, like I said, Princess Diana, who? He, I'm kidding. We all love Princess Di. I was 3 when she died, but we still love her in my house. He poured out editorial fire upon gamblers, crooked politicians. He hated gambling. He was There was a common story about a tiff that he and Albert had well when Albert came to New York,
Hmm.
because Albert loved American ice cream, and to Joey that was gluttony. Not having, we're not standing for it. So he, as a reformed Catholic, he was very Catholic in that thing of anything that gives you pleasure
Is bad for you.
is terrible for you. You're going to hell. Say a Hail Mary. He was kind of one of those people, is what it seemed like, but he's a very difficult man to read. He would assail the streetcar companies and the gas trust, which but recently had come into existence. He urged the people to understand that the Post Dispatch was their paper and their champion. So he was, again, very open and honest. Um, but sometimes he did let his own personal convictions get in the way, like with the gambling and then the whole ice cream thing.
Right.
Which, I mean, I don't appreciate people with addictions such as gambling or alcoholism as well, but it's a disease too. That could also just be the modern take on it too. I don't know.
Well, so at this point, again, like you said, he is now, you know, one of the major figures, but still in St. Louis. Eventually, we do end up getting
Yes.
him into New York.
Yes. So the Post Dispatch kind of went through a slog a little bit with John Cockrell in 1882. He was an editor for Post Dispatch. Joey was off either on his honeymoon or on vacation, something.
Hmm.
No, it's a little late for the honeymoon. Um, and he was putting out some controversial opinions while Joey was away. And it got to the point that Cockrell committed manslaughter because of these controversial opinions.
Okay.
He was putting out some not so nice things about a Colonel James O. Broadhead and Broadhead's election to Congress. Colonel A.W. Slayback, a law partner of Broadhead, allegedly barged into, there's our favorite word, barged into Cockrell's office, ready to fire, allegedly. And Cockrell, we do know, shot Slayback. Slayback bled out. He died. Sorry, not. This was while Joey's in charge of the Post-Dispatch. So, as you can imagine, it was kind of a sticky situation
Scandal.
to navigate.
Yep.
John Dillon came back after leaving for a little bit. Again, timelines are weird because it's all secondary sources. We have Dillon's word, we have Cockrell's word, we have Broadhead, but we don't really have Joey's.
Mm-hmm.
So the combination of Dillon and Joey after Joey fired Cockrell was what kind of saved face for Post-Dispatch. And now we're going to go back to 1860. Going to take it in the Wayback Machine a little bit to when the New York World first started. July 1st, 1860. It was very popular with clergymen. It was offered at a subscription rate for $4 a year, which is about a penny a day.
Right.
Just over, maybe?
Yep, a little more.
A little more. So like I said, very popular with the clergy. Quote, during the Civil War, while the paper was the principal mouthpiece of the so-called Copperheads opposed to Lincoln. Manton and Marble, one of the most ablest, ABLEST, not like we're going to judge you for disability, not like that ableist, but like literally just able in the most capacity. One of the ablest journalists of the period, became part owner and chief editor of the New York World. Now, this is going to get a little wonky, and you're going to go, what in the hell does this have to do with this? But we're going to go. We're going to go for it. So William Henry Hulbert, associate editor of Marble, was offered to purchase the paper from Marble in 1876. Hulbert couldn't afford it, but then Thomas A. Scott, a friend of Hulbert, he purchased it and put Hulbert in charge. Jay Gould eventually purchased the World in approximately 1879. Not sure of the exact date. As within 3 years, Scott managed to unload. Barrett is a very interesting author. If y'all can figure it out, have fun.
So we've got this paper that's bouncing around every few years, and now
every few years it changes hands. You know, it's always something with the World. It changes names from the World to the New York World to New York World to, there's all these amalgamations of combinations. There were some fiscal conundrums, way too complicated to get into. It's already complicated enough with the changing of hands every like 3-4 years. But long story short, Jay Gould, who purchased it from Hurlburt, and some stockholders were buying stocks and just kind of like inflating the prices of the stocks to make themselves rich. I don't know what it's called. Again, I'm not a financial person. Don't come at me. But Gould wiped out Cyrus W. Fields and had eliminated Russell Sage, the two others involved in the conundrum. And the World had served its purpose. By 1883, Gould was looking around for a buyer, or more accurately, a sucker. And who do you think this sucker is, Ben?
Pulitzer.
Joey P., our boy. So May 8th, 1883, Gould hears word that someone is interested in purchasing the New York World. Gould arranges to meet the sucker, aka our Joey, and quote, how much maneuvering was necessary to reach the final price of $346,000 in 1883 money. Let's pull it out. I'm curious. Let's see.
Well, just to put it all in perspective while you're doing the math there, he's bought these small papers for, couple hundred, couple $1,000 here.
Oh my
He made the
God.
deal with the Post-Dispatch, putting the merger together for a few $1,000s, and now all of a sudden he's got the best newspaper in St. Louis and can afford to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars to make
Yeah.
his way to New York.
Well, it was a payment plan, and going by the inflation calculator that I just used, want to take a guess? Want to play prices right?
Oh, I would say somewhere in the 20-30 million dollar range.
Oh, you were, I mean, you would have lost if you want prices right. 10.5 million.
There we go.
$10,544,058. Pretty
Well,
penny. A very pretty penny. Um, so how much maneuvering was necessary to reach the final price of $346,000 in 1883 money? We do not know. The figure did not include the building, which remains in the Gould estate to this day in 1941 when the book was published. I don't know if it's still in the Gould estate in 2023. Could be. Who knows?
maybe.
The $346,000 was just for plant and equipment. That was just for the plant. I don't know what the hell it means by just for plant, but
Ownership of the the place where the paper, not the building, but I guess
the
the paper
establishment.
and the equipment within the building.
That makes sense. For the name and the so-called goodwill and whatever advertising contracts there were. Gould would consistently stick with the story that he sold it for what he purchased it for, but that is again what's the word of the day, Ben?
Allegedly.
Allegedly. That's what he argued while discussing the sale with Joey. Is that, hey, this is what I paid for it. This is what I paid Hurlbert for it. But I think the whole fiscal conundrum had something to do
Yeah, that's probably a lie.
with that price. Again, we don't know because Joey was very close-minded, closed off with his background, and then Gould gives me this ick kind of vibe, as the cool
At this
kids
point
say.
for Pulitzer, it probably doesn't matter. He's paid his way to get into the biggest city in America, and
Right?
now he's going to make his impact.
Yeah, exactly. And he paid the initial deposit for with the proceeds from the Post Dispatch, which is why I did bring it up. Or at least that's where the initial deposit came from. The rest of the payments were made with the proceeds brought on uh from Joey and his crew owning the world.
Hmm.
So like he pretty much just made his own money for it. May 10th, 1883, Joseph Pulitzer officially became the owner of the New York World, and Joey brought all of his ideals from the Post Dispatch to the world. And with that, he had a very successful paper from the get go. And again, this was 15 years before everything's going down. So now we're going to get back to Albert. And Albert came over to New York City in 1867, just a few years after Joey did, which makes sense because he was 4 years younger than Joey.
Hmm.
He founded the Morning Journal in 1882, and this will come back later, I promise. This does. Per Barrett, Albert's goings-ons were hard to track down from that time on in 1867. We only catch brief glimpses of him, Albert. He and Joey quarreled in St. Louis for no better cause, it seems, than Albert's extravagant fondness for American ice cream. So I'm gonna guess that Albert was spending like he would have loved Ben and Jerry's. Let's put it that way.
Yeah.
I
Well,
have a
so it's
strong.
interesting. You've got these two brothers. Obviously, they come over separately. So presumably they have their own separate experiences, but both still find their way into the newspaper game.
Yeah,
Like you said, unclear whether or not, Albert's involvement in getting involved with newspapers was influenced by his older brother doing it. But Joseph Pulitzer found his own way there. Maybe Albert found his own way there as well. Maybe there was some influence, hard to say. But eventually, you've
maybe
got,
Mama had a hand.
yeah, I mean, eventually you've got these two brothers owning, papers in the biggest city in the world.
Yeah, and turn out to be two of the most infamous papers of New York City during the Progressive Era too. Because spoiler alert, Morning Journal does go on to become the New York Journal, which is the newspaper that Hearst owned. So a little bit of a spoiler there, but we can also edit that out because I like to keep surprises coming. Um, so Barrett later goes on to discuss Albert owning and founding the Morning Journal by saying the Morning Journal was a breezy affair containing mostly personal items and gossip written in spicy conversational style, but it made money from the start. And that's the important thing. Because what makes the world go round?
There you
Money.
go. It was the TMZ of its day.
And it sold for only a penny, which is the really big thing to keep in mind here. Because what did we talk about last time? Accessibility, affordability.
Mm-hmm.
Keeping the news affordable and therefore accessible. Joey found Albert to be foolish for selling it for only a penny, but then come the turn of the century, it proved to be a success because there was a lot of going back and forth. Where was it? I just read it in Seats's book about when he started selling it for a penny, the New York World. Excuse me.
So by the late 1880s, we've got
Yeah, 1880s, late 1880s, early 1890s.
Joseph Pulitzer is firmly implanted in New York. He's got his paper, The World, and now he is well on his way to having his biggest impact in as we get to the dawn of the progressive era. So this is probably a good point. You know, we've hit the very beginnings of the progressive era before we dive into the yellow journalism. We mentioned we would compare and contrast sort of the upbringings of Pulitzer, you know, very much a blue collar upbringing, as you described, comes over, works in the military, educates himself,
Pulls himself
works
up
up
by the
through the
bootstraps.
ranks to be able to own a paper, a small paper, you know, a regional paper, and then just continues to work his way up the pecking order until he's owner of the New York World.
Yeah.
Hearst, little bit of a different story, right?
Where to begin with Billy? Wee Willie Hearst. I guess birth is a good start.
As a place
He's
as any.
he was born April 29th, 1863. So again, we got the Aprils going on.
So much younger, as you
Sorry,
said.
I just heard something outside my door. He was born to Phoebe Apperson Hearst and George Hearst, and their marriage was more of a contract. It was more of a business arrangement. But Papa George is my kind of guy. he was he is the one that had the background similar to Joey. Tried and true American fella, but he did pull himself up by the bootstraps by owning. He ended up owning several mines, and he just kept making money hand over fist. But he didn't have a formal education. And then he ended up running for governor for California.
Okay.
And Papa was quoted as saying, "My opponents say that I haven't the book learning that they possess. They say I can't spell. They say I spell bird, B-U-R-D. If B-U-R-D doesn't spell bird, what in hell does it spell?" Like, he seems like that's a direct quote that Ben Proctor, author of William Randolph Hearst, The Early Years, 1863 to 1910, had said. And I wrote in the margins that I had copied, I was like, my man.
But obviously, if your father's running for governor, that's a much different upbringing than we're talking about when we talked about Pulitzer.
Yes. Well, in a sense, because Papa was, Philip Pulitzer was a very successful grain merchant. But then, 1853, the grain distillery kind of shut down, and Papa retired. Philip had retired, and that's when they moved to Budapest.
Right.
So,
But
like, they did
again,
have, yeah, it's
but by the time Pulitzer comes to America, I mean, it's almost like you're starting over at that point. Hearst
Willie
already
was a
born
year
in
old. Yeah,
America, so
yeah,
already in a different starting point.
yeah. So meanwhile, Mama Phoebe, she's simply over the moon with wee little Willie. Lets him get away with anything. Mama and Papa's marriage, like I said, more of a business agreement than an actual marriage per the prenup.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I know a prenup is a prenup is a prenup. Like, it's just a business contract, whatever. But it's just suspicious, to quote Bailey Sarian. It's suspicious. This marriage contract made and entered into this 14th day of June, 1862, between George Hearst of the one part and Phoebe E. Epperson, misspelling, of the other part, both of the country of Franklin and state of Missouri. So that's another common background between Hearst and Pulitzer is the
Right.
Missouri background. To wit, the parties to this instrument, in consideration of the covenants and stipulation hereinafter, mentions promises and agrees to intermarry with each other within a reasonable and convenient time after the execution hereof. To the said George Hearst, in consideration of said future marriage, hereby for himself conveys, assigns, and sits over unto the said Phoebe E. Epperson 50 shares of stock in the Goldine and Curry Gold and Silver Mining Company, Virginia City, Nevada, Territory, U.S. This is hard to do in all one breath, by the
I
way.
mean, you don't have to do it all in one breath. I mean, ultimately, this sort of
So,
contract does seem a little bit rare for this era.
yeah. So they were married the next day, June 15th, 1862. 9 months later, Willie's here. So that was pretty much that was Phoebe's obligation, was to provide the heir for George.
Right.
George was 41, Phoebe was 19.
Again, sort of
She
things that
she
get
was
overlooked in this
used
time.
she was used to being raised all prim and proper. She was a proper lady of the Midwestern times
Hmm.
in the 1860s. Like you mentioned, the westward expansion and everything. She was a proper lady. Her parents owned a big ranch, and if if George was off doing something, Phoebe was with her parents at
Right.
their big ranch with Willie. Um, Willie was the only child. So can you imagine how spoiled he was?
Yeah, certainly a fair guess. Again, going back to sort of the comparison, we talked about Pulitzer and, maybe not having necessarily a real formal education growing up in Europe and certainly didn't have any sort
True.
of formal education beyond military training or anything like that. Very much self-educated by the time he got into America. Hearst, I imagine, coming from this type of background, probably went through a little bit more of a formal education process.
Yes and no. It's really interesting because, like I said, where we can draw a lot of parallels, we can also draw a lot of disconnects.
Hmm.
Like, they have the Missouri background, but that's just because Mama and Daddy married in Missouri, and
Right.
Pulitzer actually went to Missouri. Uh, Daddy didn't have the best education, neither did Joey, but um, they both spoke German. They both, oh my gosh, they were both incredible mama's boys. Different senses of mama's boys. Like
Right.
Willie was just incredibly spoiled by Phoebe with love and money.
Hmm.
And then Joey just always had a picture of Louise. It's just he was the only grandchild to the Appersons as well, Phoebe's parents. So, and like I said, they have a lot of money too. So you add that with George having a lot of money from his mining, and he's just one spoiled kid. Like,
Right. So I
uh,
guess with this all this financial backing, I mean, do we get any sort of formal education? I mean, college, university starting to become, more of a thing at the time, or military
well,
academy?
there's not really that much brought up about Willie's like what we would consider elementary school. There wasn't much brought up about that. He did go on like this 20-month excursion to Europe with Mama.
Very
Um,
common.
that was in the 1870s, so he was about 8 to 10 when this was happening.
Hmm.
Um, Mama wasn't really much of a disciplinarian because she couldn't dare imagine to strike her wee Willie baby. So Papa was the one that did it, but he only allegedly only laid hands on Willie once, and that was after he had tried to light a fire in Paris with some wet hay for April
Okay.
Fool's Day. Yeah, yeah. So Willie was just like this one of those kids that you just go,
Well, Eventually these children grow up, and I mean, what do we see from Hearst as he gets into his, adult years?
He was attracted to history and politics, just like Joey was with his learning. Bright and inquisitive, he was anything but average mentally, is what Proctor states. Mama was teaching him lessons as soon as he could walk and talk. He wasn't the most popular with other kids at school, though, due to mommy and daddy's money. And it even went to the point that he wanted his pants intentionally patched up so he could look like the other boys. Um, and then we're gonna get into kind of racist territory here.
Just to throw a disclaimer out here.
Just tossing that out there. Slight trigger warning, I guess. Disclaimer. Quote, an adapt, tease, and mimic. He also amused Phoebe by learning Chinese from our houseboy and then imitating the servant's actions and expressions. More and more, he enjoyed reading interesting books, studying. So, like, Proctor just glosses over this little racist
Mm-hmm.
minute from Willie's upbringing, but I think it's really important to focus on too, because that kind of carries throughout his life
Yeah.
that I've
I mean,
noticed.
it seems it would fit in with sort of his upbringing in terms of the context of the era, especially.
He was very anti-Semitic. He was also very, which kind of plays into Joey as well, because Joey's, Philip, Joey's dad being Jewish and everything,
Hmm.
like there were a lot of times where Hearst would throw out something like, "Oh, Jew Pulitzer,"
Right.
instead of Joseph Pulitzer. It was
Hmm.
Jewish Pulitzer. Like
Hmm.
it was always meant as like a derogatory thing.
Yes.
And I just want to get that out of the way. That might come up later, probably will. So anybody that's sensitive to derogatory terms, just to let you know, it's not us saying it, it's literally historical record. Um, so Proctor just kind of glosses over this, but then goes, but he was incredibly bright. He loved history and geography and politics. So there wasn't much about his social leanings, we'll say,
Hmm.
in this book. But quote, at the same time, Willie Hearst was, as he later admitted, an ordinary American brat. So that encapsulates his upbringing based off of all the reading that I've done. In 1872, however, while Papa was away on business, Mama decided to finally go on the vacation of her dreams and do that 20-month European vacation. And she just wanted to immerse Willie in all the culture possible that she could.
Right.
Um, she was also what we would call a helicopter mom. Excuse me. I was a mother at 19 as well. I know what it's like to go, oh my God, my baby's sick. What do I do? But it sounds like she took it to an extreme.
Yeah.
Like
Well,
she would
only
cover.
child, that sort of fits with, what you would expect. I mean, obviously, like you said, I think when we compare the two, some similarities to be sure, but
Yeah,
very different in terms of maybe the psychology and how they sort of eventually grew up. Eventually, we know that Hearst is going to have to find a way to make his way in the world, even though, unlike Pulitzer, he probably has a lot more connections, having grown up with some well-to-do parents in the
that
States.
that connection was Daddy's bank account. Let's just get. um, but yeah, I mean, just one example of Phoebe was Willie contracted whooping cough in May of 1873 or 74. And then he later got very sick again, but Phoebe would just get beside herself. Like it's normal to feel upset when you're
Hmm.
and morose when your child is sick, but she took it to the extreme of like, I'll kill myself if anything happens to my baby, that kind of mentality, which again, there's nothing wrong with that, but it was just
Extreme.
from what
That's
we know
fair.
about Pulitzer and Hearst, just comparing and contrasting, like these are Louise and Phoebe were like
Hmm.
extreme opposites. And then this is important to note too, while he was on his European vacation, while in Berlin, Willie loved to converse in German. Like I said, they both spoke German. That's another
Hmm.
parallel that we're seeing. He loved to speak German with the locals. Quote, yet what really fascinated him were comic picture books called Bilderbücher. Again, not a German speaker. Don't know if that's correct pronunciation. We're just going to
We'll,
go over it.
we'll go with it.
Which he read and collected by the hundreds because Mama, whatever Willie wanted, Willie got.
Mm-hmm.
And 22 years later, this would be the basis for the Katzenjammer Kids cartoon, which is where the yellow journalism got its name from, with
There
the
you
yellow
go.
kid. And Willie also loved to draw, but Mama would only encourage him in this if he became a great artist. Only if he became a great.
Mm-hmm.
And then besides preparing for lessons each weekday, he read on average 5 books a month to feed his interests. So he was like, I relate, nose in a book all the time. I can relate. But then early in November of 1874, they arrived home. Their glorious adventure of 20 months had been over. In 1876, Papa had a few large, successful business ventures, buying and flipping real estates. So then, with all these huge financial windfalls, Phoebe says, let's go to the East Coast. Because he's being brought up in California, and in that, I think it was the West Coast at this time.
So they do get from Missouri to California at some point.
Yeah, well, a lot of the mining companies that George had owned were in Nevada.
Okay.
So it kind of makes sense that they would just kind of keep. And then in 1849 too, there was the gold rush in Sacramento or San Francisco. What city has the
Northern
49ers?
San Francisco. Well, but so Northern California, Northern Central California.
I ask you, the sports guy, because the 49ers is named after the gold rush. I know that much.
Yes.
So they're on the West Coast. You know, they have all this money from the gold and the silver mines. Like, they're just rolling in the dough. So, teenager in hiding, Willie, who now preferred to be called Will. So we're going to drop the Willie for now until he starts acting like he's 3 again.
Mm-hmm.
He developed this love and affection for Charles Dickens, William Makepeace Thackeray. He wrote the book called Vanity Fair. Sir Walter Scott, and Will, during this time, also became accustomed to Will. Which, say it with me, shocker.
Mm-hmm.
1878, 16-year-old Will Hearst attends school where? Concord, New Hampshire.
There you go. So we
St.
do
Paul's
finally get
Episcopal.
into, more of a formal education here.
He does, yes. He goes to a boarding school called for those that aren't familiar or not from New Hampshire, St. Paul's Episcopal School is a pretty.
It's one of the New England prep schools. There's a ton of
I
them.
don't want to say it has a certain prestige because there was that scandal that happened a few years ago too,
Well,
with
let's put
those
that to
3
the side.
boys there.
It is a notable prep school in New England.
It's like an Ivy League high school.
Yeah.
Put it that way, like Dartmouth, but for high school. And surprise, surprise, he hated it because the headmaster and the professors were not as lax as Mama.
Not able to get
Like
away
I
with
said,
what he's used to getting away with.
Mama let this kid get away with anything.
Mm-hmm.
He set off a fake fire with wet hay in Paris.
So I'm guessing he doesn't last very long at St. Paul's.
No, 1 year.
So not even enough to really get credit for graduating.
No. Well, actually, it's kind of unclear. Proctor says from the very beginning in September 1879, he was unhappy, and then he quotes a letter from Hearst to Mama. Everything is so dull, he wrote to his mother. I am just homesick all the time. And he then pleads with Mama to call him to New York City. He's like, I'll use private tutors. I'll do this. He threw out all of his chips on the table, like all of them, to escape whatever frozen hell New Hampshire is like. He was just not it. But then he couldn't acclimate. He couldn't acclimate apparently because then he went to Harvard in 1882. So freshman year, he took, the regular prescription of Latin, Greek, German, chemistry, algebra, and he passed all of them with about an average of 70%. So he wasn't like
not an outstanding student, but good enough to get by.
Yeah, he's not a 4.0 student. he's a gentleman's passing, I think is what it was called in the book. Like,
Mm-hmm.
he gave just enough of a care to go, I don't want to upset my mom and dad
Right.
and flunk out. But then he kind of dropped out his junior year in 1884. There was this rustication. I haven't found any clarification on what that is. Let me see if Professor Google says anything. The type of decorative masonry achieved by cutting the back edges of stones. That's not what I'm looking for.
Don't think that's going to apply here. Anyway, he leaves Harvard. Does he finally
Oh,
get
he was
into New
kind of
York?
expelled from
Okay.
Harvard. Still no word on if he actually got his degree that I've been able to find. I'll check again in Citizen Hearst, but I have, and we can go back and edit. I don't know. But he was refused his degree from Harvard, even after Mama was throwing the checkbook
Right.
at the dean and everybody. Quote, so at age 22, William Randolph Hearst was at loose ends without purpose and direction. Soon, however, he would decide to open another avenue for his energies, a new field of endeavor, which, much to the consternation and horror of his parents. So we're going to jump back a couple years to 1880. George purchases the San Francisco Examiner, which is a newspaper daily in, surprise, San Francisco.
Yep.
1886, Will had all these ideas to improve the circulation. Because he's like, well, Dad, what if you do this, that, and the other? He wrote a letter to George explaining these while he was, I'm assuming, in New York City. I don't know where he was when he wrote this letter. Will also started working for the New York World for Joey in 1886. So the two legends actually were working together
Right.
cohesively.
Just as a reporter or somewhere
I'm
does
sorry,
it say? Does it say what he was doing? Was he working as a reporter or was he
reporter.
working?
He was
Okay.
he was a reporter for New York World. Sorry.
So it's interesting. You wonder, I mean, Joseph Pulitzer, hard to say, whether or not he necessarily did the face-to-face hiring of just this one reporter, but you wonder if he knew Hearst's background and knew that his father owned another major paper in the country, it's opposite coasts, so it may not necessarily have been, a clear connection at the time.
Yeah, I'm not sure because like I said earlier, I'm going to keep going back to this. Joey was very off limits.
Mm-hmm.
Like his mental faculties were very off limits. But then Will was so melodramatic. It's hard to tell if things actually happened the way that Will says they did,
Mm-hmm.
or if he was just being a drama queen. Like, I hate to throw that out there. I'm trying to paint as objective a picture as I can of these two people based off what I know. And this is what I know is like when he was in Harvard, he wrote his mother about um having diarrhea, and he used like all these huge words. And I wrote in the margins, I was like, drama queen. Like, tell me you're a drama queen without saying you're one. Like,
Right. Well, I mean, certainly it informs the psychology of the person a little bit. So, ultimately, like you said, Hearst ends up working for Pulitzer at the World, while at the same time, his father owns the San Francisco Examiner. Does Hearst end up going west to own the Examiner?
yes. It again, timeline got convoluted here. It's 1886. We're still kind of ramping up to the big show here. Excuse me. Proctor says Hearst solidified his convictions concerning reforms for the Examiner, as well as intensifying his ambitions to institute them personally. So he was pretty much saying, Daddy, pick me.
Mm-hmm.
Like, let me have a turn. And why? Through example, the World was a constant catalyst, a daily reminder of what he thought future journalism ought to be. So he idolized Pulitzer. He
Right.
wanted a newspaper to be just like the World, but on the West Coast.
Mm-hmm.
And so he worked for Pulitzer, which is the intriguing part to me anyway, because like I didn't know that until I read this book.
Right.
Well, of the early years. Um, he would constantly pick apart the daily edition of the World. Like he would like take it apart, literally take it apart, and hang it up in his bedroom, and just
Hmm.
go, "Well, this is working for Mr. Pulitzer.
Hmm.
This is not. Like, let me send this to Dad and see what Dad thinks. Like, let
Right.
me send my ideas to Dad, see what he thinks." So he wanted to get a feel of how the wheels turn and what made it so successful. And this is where he got the ideas to turn around the successes of the Examiner and then subsequently the Journal. Uh, then, ever so gradually in 1886, Will Hearst strove to attain his dream. For a number of months while working for the World, he continued to observe and investigate firsthand all aspects of its operations. Whenever possible, he sounded out experienced newsmen such as Sam Chamberlain, posing questions to which they could apply their journalistic knowledge. And then Ballard Smith was also an editor who, this is kind of where the turning starts.
Okay.
Because Ballard Smith, like I said, he was an editor for the World. He also made his way to Will's hero list, as well as Napoleon, Charlemagne, Samuel J. Tilden. Like Will had all these military heroes. So that's something else
Hmm.
to keep in mind, is that he had this militaristic point of plotting. Like I have a strong feeling he probably read The Art of War while he was at Harvard.
Right.
Like um and this man, Ballard Smith, he Will loved his opinions.
Hmm.
He wanted to steal Ballard away from Joey, offered $7,000 a year for salary, which, let me go back to my calculator here. 7,000 in 1886. Whoa. $229,000 in today's money
No.
per year. Uh, to which Papa was just like, "No, Will, what the hell are you doing? No." Um, Smith also declined the position, told Will, "Don't spend your money on these high priced editors, be your own."
Hmm.
So that's what he did. So Will said, "Okay, so we'll be my own editor." And then March 4th, 1887, Papa finally gave in, said, "Yeah, whatever, take charge of the Examiner, take it off my hands." Attracted like barely any notice from the subscribers. They were just like,
Right.
"Cool." Page 2 in the March 4th, 1887 edition,
Hmm.
W.R. Hearst, proprietor. Um, Eventually, the flamboyant Willie Hearst did make his presence known to the readers of the Examiner because he brought on like sports coverage, yacht racing, all this fun stuff, human interest stories.
Right.
And then let me try to find
So
what
finally able to apply those principles that he sort of learned while
ex-
watching during his time working for Pulitzer. He's now able to apply them as he takes over out in San Francisco. And then I imagine it's not long before he makes his way back to New York, though.
no, it's really not. This is where I stopped taking notes, so just bear with me. February 20th, 1887, when he was already on the job, the front page makeup began to take on this new face. The headlines doubled in size from a quarter inch to half inch, which we saw with Joey
Right.
becoming a thing. Let's see. Sorry, we're kind of I hit my wall.
This is where we start to see those first few hallmarks of what would become yellow journalism, the big bold headlines and more
Yes.
photography, more artwork getting involved, and this is just the newspaper revolution at work.
Yes, it is very much. Uh, where's the am I in the wrong chapter?
Well, eventually we know that Hearst will make his way back to New York, right? And you said another interesting twist sort of in this rivalry or in this budding rivalry and in this saga
Oh,
is that as Hearst does make his way back to New York, it's sort of his gateway in is through Pulitzer's brother.
Yeah, so for about 8 years, he was making a name for himself in San Francisco with the Examiner. Let's see, where'd it go? There's another page. Sorry. According to Don Seitz, early in 1895, John R. McLean, owner of the Cincinnati Enquirer, had paid Albert Pulitzer $1 million for the New York Morning Journal. And John McLean is who Hearst had purchased the journal from. But before that, I do kind of need to go back into Hearst's xenophobia, because this is also time of the railroad building and everything else, and this ties into the effect on European immigrants. Um, One thing he did to increase the sales of the Examiner and the circulation sales and the advertisement contracts was he was promoting the Examiner as pro-Californian, pro-American, which turned out to be often xenophobic, anti-Chinese, anti-German, at times French and English. Like, he was just America first
Mhm.
kind of guy. Like, he had this thing.
Well, it starts probably with, being born in the States as we race off to find yet another primary source. Uh,
Yes, I'm
and
sorry.
especially in California in the 1800s, the anti-Asian sentiment was strong, even though, they were using Asian immigrant work in a lot of areas, especially like you said, building the railroads.
Yes. Where did it go?
So I imagine that sentiment of, America first very much follows him uh, from San Francisco as he takes over the New York Journal.
Yes, it did, and I just had that.
So while
There's
we
the
have Pulitzer, who was an immigrant himself, eventually rises to take over the New York World, and through his newspaper revolution, his new journalistic practices, his new way of selling papers, you could say, likely, although not directly, would maybe be a little bit more sympathetic to the immigrant cause. Hearst is just, even though his papers
anti.
are will end up being purchased by immigrants, very much in the vein of, not sympathetic to the immigrant cause.
I'm so sorry. I didn't have it, and it was here. Oh, in San Francisco, the Chinese multiplied the Examiner noted, quote, at an alarming rate. The negative aspects of their culture and lifestyle were constantly denounced: opium dens, prostitution, payoffs to police, unwillingness to speak English and participate in local affairs. So at this point, Hearst is like, just, like I mentioned earlier with the Chinese houseboy, like, things are starting to, Willie, your racism showing a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
Um, this part really kind of upset me. It actually really did upset me. But more importantly, the Chinese worked longer hours for less pay, thereby depriving Americans of a livelihood in the factories and businesses in San Francisco, as well as California vineyards and farms. So in January of 1889, the Examiner proposed a labor train that would bring white labor to the state. But after a month, because of little public reaction, Hearst discarded this idea as unfeasible.
Yeah, well, certainly a trope that was started then and has been used since, but not necessarily uncommon. And again, when we start to get into really the rivalry picking up at the, almost the turn of the century, now you've got these two papers, both have sort of dramatically changed face over the previous decade, and now they become, two of the dominant papers in America.
Right. And like I said, 1890. So he's been just riding this train, pun fully intended, on the Examiner for 7, 8 years now.
Mm-hmm.
So we went from 1887 to 1895. Like he is just killing it in California. He is, and then he just kind of gets bored. So he says, "What's in New York? Let's go back to New York, see what Joey's got going on." Kind of that
Mm-hmm.
big thing. And then he sees, "Oh wait, morning journals for sale. Wonder what I can do with that." So 1895, he pretty much performs like this mass exodus of just hoisting people from Pulitzer. Just uh let's see what Seats has to say. I remember reading about it a lot.
Well,
The
so it
note
would make sense, right? Like you were talking about, if he learned all of these new principles of selling papers under Pulitzer, it would only make sense that when he finally acquires his own in New York, he would try to
yes,
basically
I remember this
sweep the
guy.
rug out from under him.
Yeah. So like I said before, Don Seats worked with Pulitzer very closely, very dear friend of Pulitzer's. So I've been kind of considering this as a primary source, even though it rides the line of being primary and secondary,
Hmm.
just because the latter part of it, it's like, well, then Mr. Pulitzer called me into his office, and I was just like, whoa, wow, that's right, you worked with him. I forgot about that kind of vibe. So Don Seats, though no great signs of extravagance or energy were at first manifested, the paper grew, and it was evident that Mr. Hearst had a powerful purpose behind him, to say nothing of money. That he had picked the world as his antagonist soon became apparent. The assaults were made within and without the office. So he is just like, I want you, I want you. And one of the big things is Moral Goddard. This name, nobody knows. As far as like you would know Pulitzer or Hearst, you'd be able to pick those names out. You go, oh yeah,
Hmm.
newspapers, right? Moral Goddard, nobody knows, but I do. I know Moral. Moral created this comic strip, not necessarily Cats and Jammer Kids. I've been trying to find an exact like historiography of Moral Goddard cartoons. Can't
Hmm.
find one. So I'm just gonna go with what Dawn wrote, because Dawn is the closest thing that I have.
Gotcha.
Mr. Goddard yielded to the offer in late January of 1896, and to the consternation of the establishment, moved out, taking all hands with him. So Goddard was this cartoonist. As I said, it's still very unclear of if it was Hogan's Alley or if it was the Cats and Jammer Kids. There was this kid wearing a yellow smock, and I can probably let's
So this is where the roots of the yellow journalism, the term yellow journalism, are
this is
based.
exactly where the term the yellow journalism comes from. I'm going to share my screen. I just had a panic attack, thought that it was not recording anymore. So this little guy right here, I don't know if you can see that.
No, not yet.
Oh, is it not? Oh, because I didn't click the share button.
Yep. Here it comes.
So this little guy, well, holy gee, here's to you. This is the story of me sweet young life. A, RF out cults. It's been debated who has been credited, but it was just this very racist caricature of, again, Asian American child,
Right.
which is why he's called the Yellow Kid.
Yes.
So that's how yellow journalism got its name, is because the Yellow Kid was in it.
Hmm.
And it was the same author work, or the same cartoonist, because Outcult also worked for the World and the Journal as well, because Hearst just liked to throw daddy's money everywhere.
Hmm.
Uh, George passed away shortly before this, so Willie and Phoebe, and of course, because Phoebe's still just like my baby boy, she could never say no to her sweet darling boy, was just like, sure, honey, here's $500,000 in 1883 money. You're like, hey, have fun, kind of. And he would just say, Mama, I need money. And she would just dig into George's estate, give it to
Right.
him. So he was able to offer all this money. Um, but the circulation battles just kept kind of stagnating and not stagnating.
They were going back and forth, and
Yes, thank
they
you.
were in big business.
No, they were in competition, and we can get into this more later as well. It's just Hearst was just out for blood. Nobody knows why exactly, just probably because he just wanted his name to be in the history books. I don't know. Nobody knows what Hearst was up to. I mean, like what his ulterior motives were. Um, Strong as he was in imitating the world, Mr. Hearst was weak in originating. So he would, but then if you read a book like William Randolph Hearst, the early years, Pulitzer and the Journal and the World were the ones that were copying
Right.
Hearst. So there was
Yeah.
actually one story that I laughed at pretty hard. I'm not gonna lie. Earlier today when they were discussing the Spanish American War. We can get into this a little bit later too.
Well,
Um,
and we talked about this in the introductory episode where, this sinking of the Maine really was arguably the touchstone point and maybe the peak of yellow journalism here during the Progressive era.
oh, exactly. It's been cited as like the start of it, but W. Joseph Campbell, he wrote an excellent book called The Year That Defined American Journalism, 1897 and the Clash of Paradigms. And he provides this whole outline of the year 1897 and what exactly he was setting the stage for 1898 to happen.
Mm-hmm.
Like every minor event that could be related to the Maine is in that book. And it is a fantastic book. I highly recommend it to anybody that wants to learn more.
Well, and it's clear here we've got, two newspaper moguls who are, just gung ho chasing down every single story that could pop up.
And Hearst, he should have become like a war novel writer instead of a newspaper man. Because he was, even Proctor admits, like, he was just making stuff up, whatever he could. And then had a friend named Arthur McEwen that worked with him. Arthur Brisbane was another person that he kind of yoink from Pulitzer.
Mm-hmm.
I'm kind of jumping the gun here, but this story is so funny. So McEwen and Brisbane, they wanted to just test the waters as to if the world was actually lifting their stories. June 8th, the Journal published a dispatch from Cuba stating that during a naval bombardment, quote, Colonel Reflippe W. Thenus, an Austrian artillerist of European renown, was so badly wounded that he has since died, end quote. The next day, the World reported in all its 20 or more editions, Willis Abbott laughingly recollected an equally official-looking dispatch that stated, on board the World Dispatch boat, 3 friends off Santiago de Cuba via Port Antonio, Jamaica, Colonel R.W. Thenus, an Austrian artillerist well known throughout Europe, was so badly wounded that he has since died. McEwen and Brisbane were ecstatic. To the delight of New Yorkers, they crucified the distinguished world editors by pointing out that the story was a hoax, that their famous Reflippy W. Thenus was appropriately a disguised anagram for We Pilfer the News.
So essentially, they planted a fake story to see,
Yeah,
and the world went for it.
just to test, and the world bit it and chewed it off, and I just laughed so hard because you have to see it written out, but Reflippy is literally just E pilfer backwards.
Mm-hmm.
It's REFLIPE, and then W the news.
There you go.
And I just I laughed so hard reading that. I was like, I don't know why this is so funny, but here you go.
I mean, this was the era. This was this rivalry really encapsulated, and
It
these
reminded
two
me
these two guys going back and forth.
it reminded me of Bart Simpson prank calling Moe. Like uh Lee Key Bum,
Hmm.
that kind of phrase. But yeah, so again, yellow journalism did not start in 1898, started in 1897 is when the vernacular made its way, or is when the vocabulary term made its way into the American vernacular. Uh, According to Campbell, made an appearance in a small headline near the bottom of page 6 of the New York Press on the last day of January in 1897. And this was the beginning of the journalism craze that would not phase out until about 20 years later. It's still, like we discussed, it's still sensational journalism, nothing new.
No.
It's nothing old, it's nothing new. We can date it back to the Reynolds pamphlet. We can date it back to the Salem witch trials. We can date it back to Croatoa. We can keep pushing it back further and further. And then we're still seeing it. Like, Princess Diana's still alive. We'll just keep that example going.
Well, but this
According to
obviously
National
during
Enquirer.
during this specific era, this was, as you talked about, both Hearst and Pulitzer, went through their revolutionary spells, transforming their respective papers along the way, and obviously, captured the attention of, hundreds of thousands, eh, arguably millions of Americans at this point in terms of, you know, news was now becoming more accessible to everybody, and the news was really what they told you it was.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a lot harder, obviously, then to have separate, independent, verifiable sources. So, stories could be a little bit more sensationalized if that's what was going to sell papers.
And I just want to kind of contrast it with probably the most objective of all newspapers at this time, with the New York Times. Even though, like, they did participate in the yellow journalism craze about 10 years too late when they were covering the newspaper strike. You good?
Yep,
I
still
was like,
here.
where'd he go? um, they did, when they were covering the newspaper strike, they did kind of take the sensational headlines and they made them big and bold, but that's for later. When the Maine was blown up, it just says the Maine blown up. Terrible
Uh,
explosion on board the United States battleship in Havana Harbor. Many persons killed and wounded. And that and the Maine blown up were the only things that were in caps. So, like, nothing, like, it was still a tragedy. Don't get me
mhm.
wrong. Terrible. But the reason that the Maine was docked is because Hearst was making all these things happen with,
Yeah.
saying, like, hey, Spain imprisoned somebody that's related to the president of Cuba. That's kind of
Hmm.
shitty. Like,
It was the difference between fact reporting, which was more of what the Times was doing, as opposed to, outright conjecture and, you know, reporting opinion as fact, which is more of what the journal was involved with. And it feels like the world maybe didn't quite go to that extent, and that maybe has more to do with Pulitzer being a little bit older and being a little bit more, um, you know,
a little
arguably
wiser.
mature than Hearst.
I wouldn't say mature, I'd say more realistic.
Yeah. And maybe just like you said, maybe more sticking to his principles, in terms of transparency and stuff like that, and not necessarily wanting to initiate the news through the paper.
Right. Um, like I said, this can all go back to 1897 because Hearst is really setting the stage for this war. He's really, like, he wants something big to happen. He didn't necessarily want the Maine to be blown up. If it was actually blown up, we still don't know. Again, putting that out there. Like I said, first, ta-da! The term yellow journalism first appears in print January 31st, 1897, from the New York, bottom of page 6 of the New York Press. Throughout 1897, there's so many key moments. As like, I can show you my little. That's just from the timeline that Campbell
All those
provided.
notes.
All those annotations. February 18th, the World publishes a dispatch written by Sylvester Scoville. So each paper had sent down correspondence. The Journal had Richard Harding Davis, and then the World had Sylvester Scoville. Just kind of keeping an eye on things, like what's happening, because tensions were already getting a little sticky.
Mm-hmm.
So they just wanted to, be the first man on the site for the story. So Sylvester Scoville writes a dispatch to the World, smuggled from his jail cell in Cuba. Not sure why he was arrested. Held on 4 counts, including communicating with the Cuban insurgents and traveling with forged papers. The World declared, this is February 5th, the World declares Scoville to be in imminent danger of butchery.
Which could have been an outright lie. We don't know.
Exactly.
But
Well,
that's, perfect
but it's
example.
Pulitzer's paper, so it's like maybe Scoville wrote that, and then the
Right.
World just kind of went with
Perfect,
it.
perfect small example of the sensationalism that would be going on.
How the smallest thing can be like, whoa.
Yeah, exactly.
February 18th, the World publishes a dispatch written by Scoville and smuggled from his jail cell in Cuba. In it, Scoville calls himself a prisoner of war. In fact, the conditions of Scoville's detention border on the luxurious. So it's just like this kind of, so what you said, it probably was Scoville that wrote, like, I am in imminent danger of
Mm-hmm.
butchery. Like,
But he probably wasn't in, a
Cal
luxurious
McKinley.
palace either.
Right.
So the truth eventually will lie somewhere in between.
Exactly. March 4th of 1897, McKinley is sworn in because he was just elected in 1896, which that was a huge election debacle similar to 2016. If you catch my drift.
Mm-hmm.
March 10th, the World reports that Scoville is to be released without trial, will soon leave Cuba for the United States. The newspaper's high-profile efforts to win his freedom have helped make Scoville the best-known journalist in America till Davis comes along. April 22nd, the first issue of the Yiddish language daily newspaper. Forgive me again, I don't speak Yiddish.
It's all right.
Forwards. The newspaper is still published as a weekly in English and in Yiddish.
There you
go. Fun fact. June 27th, a man's headless torso washes up on the East River in New York City. Sounds completely irrelevant, right?
But
not when Willie Hearst gets a hold of the story. So you know it's going to be fun. July 3rd, New York Journal solves the East River murder mystery with Hearst's murder squad. But Ben, I'm going to ask you, why true crime now in 2023?
yeah, well, he was
Why
doing
true
his own.
crime now?
He was doing his own investigative journalism then.
Victim is identified as William Golden Suppy. Don't speak Turkish. But he was a Turkish man. I don't know if he was an immigrant. We don't know. We just know that his name was William Goldensup.
Mm-hmm.
And it leads authorities to the chief suspects of the crime. The chief suspects, they confess. So Hearst is riding this high, man. He is like, I solved a murder, bitches. Like, he's kind of in that mindset, right? He's high on his horse. A couple months pass. August 17th, New York Journal discloses that a young Cuban woman, Evangelina Cosillo y Cisneros, again, I took French, has been in prison for more than a year in Havana's wretched Casa de Recogidas. Email us at starchiveslog@gmail if I'm wrong. Please include a voice recording of how to pronounce these things because I don't know. The Journal calls her the Cuban girl martyr and begins a noisy but ultimately unsuccessful petition drive to force Spain to set her free. August 28th, Carl Decker, Washington-based reporter for the Journal, arrives in Havana. He's on a mission to free Cisneros. He's like gonna
Hmm.
get Evangelina out of there. Um,
But so these are, again, these are all examples of sort of
these are
almost soap operatic stories.
he's setting the stage for something to go down in Cuba. He doesn't know
Right.
what's gonna go down in Cuba, but he's getting it ready.
Yeah.
Hearst allegedly, word of the day, PB Herman would be so proud of us. R.I.P. He allegedly told an artist that he had hired to go down to Cuba. Like this artist was just making up pictures. Like he was
Hmm.
drawing pictures of non-consensual acts
Yep.
of Cuban women and Spanish soldiers.
Hmm.
Put it that way to
Yep.
not get censored out.
Got it.
Um, he was drawing up these pictures. Like I said, trigger warnings abound. Uh, so this artist was drawing these pictures, and then the artist was just like, uh, he's starting to get a little bit of cold feet because he's like, this
Hmm.
doesn't feel right, man. Hearst says, allegedly, you furnish the pictures, I'll furnish the war.
There you go.
So
Famous quote.
and then Pulitzer is kind of like, well, we want to outsell these papers from, over Willie. October 10th, and headlines 4 lines deep. The New York Journal takes credit for organizing the escape and flight of Evangelina Cisneros. It calls the jailbreak the greatest journalistic coup of this age. Cisneros arrives in New York City on October 13th. So they free Evangelina. Again, Hearst is he's riding the high from the murder, and then he's riding this high from getting Evangelina, like,
Hmm.
out of jail, out of Dodge. Like, we won, baby. December 12th, the Katzenjammer Kids comic makes its debut in the New York Journal. It will become the longest running newspaper comic strip.
There you go.
December 23, a couple days before Christmas. Pulitzer, proprietor of New York World, privately acknowledges that his arch rival, the New York Journal, has become a wonderfully able and attractive and popular newspaper. Sylvester Scovell of the World, in a capstone to a remarkably full and energetic year of reporting, interviews the Cuban insurgent leader, General Maximo Gomez,
Hmm.
who reasserts his opposition to Spain's offer of limited home rule in Cuba. And then New Year's Eve, Hearst loved to throw parties. He
Wow.
loved
Yes.
he loved to throw daddy's money around. But here's the thing about Hearst. He did not like to be the center of attention. He really did not. Like if he was in a room with photographs being taken, he would stay off to the side.
Hmm.
He did not like the limelight. He just wanted success and money.
He just wanted credit after the fact.
Kind of. It's very, they're both, again, drawing parallels. They are both very hard men to read, Pulitzer
Hmm.
and Hearst, because you have Hearst who, you furnish the pictures, I'll furnish the war. But yet you don't want a picture taken of you. Like there's very few pictures of him taken when he was married to Millicent Wilson, later on Millicent Hearst. There are very few pictures of them like freshly
Right.
married, fresh parents and everything like that. He was just very, I don't want to say camera shy, but that's more of the word that I'm leaning towards,
Hmm.
more of the descriptor, because he did not want to be in the limelight. He didn't want to be the center of attention. He wanted the credit, but he didn't want to be front and center,
Right.
if that makes sense.
Oh, it definitely does, given the background. And, I think this is a perfect place to wrap up. Obviously, we talked a lot about, comparing these two, giants of media at this time. And, you know, again, two signatories of this progressive era and the time,
Oh yeah.
and the rivalry that they had obviously dramatically changed not just the way that we consume news, but had lasting effects, both on policy and on the general population, which we've already touched on a little bit. We're going to get more into that as well.
Yeah.
But as we hit into the 1900s, we do eventually see a turn. If you could say the explosion of the Maine is, maybe the high point of yellow journalism and
Kind
its
of
sort of excesses. As we get towards, the Teddy Roosevelt presidency and some of the hallmarks of the progressive era, we start to see a little bit more of a turn against yellow journalism, and that is due to sort of its archetypical opposite, which is muckraking. And we will get more into muckraking, how the term came about, which we already discussed a little bit in our first episode, uh, who some of the primary muckrakers were and what their cause was and what it led to. And, muckraking and yellow journalism, again, two great terms of this era, Katrina, and interesting to see how they stand somewhat similar, but also in stark contrast to one another.
very similar to Pulitzer and Hearst. Like we can draw a lot of parallels, but also contrast significantly.
Mhm.
We still also have to cover the Spanish American War in those headlines because woohoo, those are some A+ headlines. We'll say that. They're torpedo hole.
All right. Well, that will do it for another edition of the Dusty Archives. We want to thank you for tuning in. I hope we taught you a thing or two today, and we will be back with our next episode talking about the fall of yellow journalism a little bit and the muckrakers of the progressive era.
Well, yeah, stay safe, people. Have fun. Take care of yourselves.